Hi, welcome to the mini lecture concerning the Reformation. What we're going to take a look at in this lecture is the fragmentation, if you will, of Christianity as it started to kind of happen and progress and evolve from the late 1400s through the 1500s and into the early 1600s. If we take a look at the Reformation in terms of what caused it, we find the causes for the Reformation in the last 200 to 300 years of that time period we call the medieval age or the Middle Ages. Starting in the 1300s, what we see happening is we see if we call it a crisis of faith developing in terms of the Christian church. These events that you might not be familiar with, for example, the Avignon papacy, was a time period in which the popes moved from the city of Rome to the French city of Avignon. And this move of the papacy caused a lot of confusion and a lot of misunderstanding, and also it constituted a violation, in fact, of established church policy. The Avignon papacy was followed in terms of importance. It was followed by an event we call the Great Schism. And the Great Schism was a time period in which there were more than one religious leader claiming to be the Pope and head of the Roman Catholic Church. As time went on, the Great Schism pretty much devolved out of control and created an extreme crisis of faith and leadership for the Catholic Church. And that all kind of leads to point number B, which was an increasing dissatisfaction on the part of the Christians or the Catholics of Europe, an increasing dissatisfaction with the popes themselves. Now, there was also a secondary issue, which is called a crisis of salvation, which revolved around the Catholic principle or the Catholic teaching about indulgence. Now, not to be too complex, but basically an indulgence was an act that would produce a spiritual reward, more often than not relating to a reduced amount of punishment for sin. And what had started to happen in the late 13 and into the 1400s was that there was an actual widespread scandal of these indulgences being sold by representatives of the Catholic Church. And so the misappropriation, the misuse of these indulgences, combined with a dissatisfaction with the popes, combined in a third way with a growing German resentment of the Catholic Church, all came to a head to kind of form that set of circumstances that resulted in the Protestant Reformation. Now, it's important to remember that the Martin Luther's Reformation, if you will, was not necessarily a product of Martin Luther's actions, but rather, one could argue, a product of the circumstances and the sign of the times. It just so happened that Martin Luther came into his attempts to reform the Catholic Church, first internally and then later externally. He came to that at a time period where the Christian or the Catholic Church was weak and could not actually prevent the actions of Martin Luther. And so what happened is, primarily on the sale of indulgences, but other issues, Martin Luther started out by initially trying to reform the Catholic Church internally. He was a monk and basically a vowed member of the clergy, but as he found increasing obstacles put in his way, he moved outside of the Christian or Catholic Church and started the reform movement through political means. And the ultimate result, of course, was the creation of a new Christian religion, which is commonly referred to as Lutheranism. And very basically put, what Lutheranism did was it sought to reduce the need for a, quote, church, and it replaced that kind of ideology of a Catholic relationship between God, church, and man. It replaced that with a one-on-one individual relationship between God and the individual. And in order to do that, Luther had to take out what were called the sacraments, in terms of creating that kind of model in order to get rid of the church hierarchy, in order to get rid of the church involvement in personal sacrifice, salvation. He took out the idea of the church being involved, and he based his religion on what we call sola fides, which is Latin for faith alone. Now, what happened is when Martin Luther put these ideas out, he soon found traction in terms of spreading his message through a couple of different modes. The first and foremost technology that had occurred was a massive technological change in 1450 with the creation of the printing press. And the printing press enabled Martin Luther to get his ideas out before the Catholic Church could actually stifle them or censor them. On top of that, in Germany, where Martin Luther was based, the King, Charles V, he was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he was extremely unpopular and weak when it came to being the ruler of the Germanic lands where Martin Luther lived. It's interesting to note that Charles V was also the King of Spain, and in terms of his control of Spain, he was able to lock down and prevent the Protestant Reformation there. Now, in terms of a long story short, Charles V tried to crack down on Luther, but it was the actions of the German princes intervening for Luther that wound up producing a civil war, if you will, in which both Lutheranism, Catholicism, or Roman Catholicism as it was called now, as well as other Protestant faiths that had grown up, it was basically a free-for-all, followed by a lot of religious tension, religious violence, and just kind of an instability within European society. In 1555, at a so-called Peace of Augsburg, there was an attempt to kind of eliminate that instability by creating a basic rule that we refer to as Curius Regio Eius Religio, which is Latin for whatever the ruler's religion was, that became the religion of all of the people in his kingdom. And the idea behind this was to basically create single religious communities, and by that we mean like a state community, that everyone would be unified in that religious identity and ideology. But the problem was, when the Peace of Augsburg was implemented, it forced widespread societal upheaval as populations were forced to move here and there. And the overarching goal that was the goal of the Peace of Augsburg, which was to prevent violence and warfare, that was only made all the more intense when these now separate groups of people targeted other peoples. Now, in terms of our continuing Reformation, immediately after Lutheranism was born, we then have the creation of separate Protestant religions, both out of the Roman Catholic Church, as well as different groups of Lutherans breaking off and creating their own religious ideologies. Some of the more popular, or one of the most popular ones in terms of Central Europe, was the religion known as Calvinism. And not to put too much effort into explaining and defining Calvinism, the main difference between Lutheranism and Calvinism was a belief in what was called predestination, in which Calvin argued that since God knew everyone's actions and God knew everything, that there really was no free will, that everyone was either predestined to either go to heaven or hell. And because of that, one could never really alter their fate, but one could find different means to kind of indicate what the outcome was. And one of the main things John Calvin argued was kind of a sign of being saved was financial or economic greatness or economic growth in terms of one's personal income. And so, in an interesting kind of turn of irony, religious salvation or religious identity became based on financial security. And that was an idea that was also taken up by another group of Protestants known as the Puritans, who kind of infused their religion with a thing we call the Puritan work ethic, which argued that people, if they wanted to prove they were saved, they needed to work hard and save their money. But beyond John Calvin, what we see happening all over Europe is once the floodgates are open and Christianity begins to break apart, we see that fragmentation continue from first one Christian religion, the Catholic Church, to then two, being Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, to being three, and so on and so forth. And that trend of fragmentation only continued. Now, before we move on to the Roman Catholic Church's response, we do have to kind of highlight a different type of Reformation that occurred, which is called the English Reformation. And it's important to note that the English Reformation was in fact something very different. The English Reformation was born or created out of Henry VIII's desire for a divorce, not necessarily a difference in terms of belief. Long story short, again, is that Henry VIII needed a male heir, and he was basically locked into a marriage where his wife was unable to produce a male heir. And so he argued for an annulment, which was a way to basically dissolve the marriage and then choose a new spouse that could produce an heir. But unfortunately for Henry, the Roman pontiff, the Pope, basically denied his request. And in retaliation of that, Henry VIII then basically separated himself from the Catholic Church, proclaimed a new church, and created what we call the Church of England in 1534. Now, originally, this Reformation, if you will, the English Reformation, was simply a political split, not a religious split or a difference in belief in terms of the different religions. But over time, that political split then gave rise to different beliefs in Anglicanism, which is the common term for the Church of England today, and it continued to form kind of a void that separated the Church of England and the Catholic Church as time went on. Now, as we mentioned, there was a dramatic need for a reforming, if you will, of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, in a lot of ways, had seemed to kind of go off track in terms of its ritualistic kind of expression. And what we see happening in the Counter-Reformation is a refocus of the Catholic Church upon Christ and the sacraments. And an organization was created within the Catholic Church to kind of direct that, which is a group of a religious order that we call the Society of Jesus, otherwise commonly referred to as the Jesuits. And the Catholic Church, in a lot of ways, looked to combat the spread of Protestantism through education and through a focus on the more basic fundamental elements of Christianity. And it was highly successful in one sense, but not as successful in another. The main area where the Jesuits were extremely successful was in actually spreading Christianity, Catholicism, to parts of the world that had just been discovered. For example, the Jesuits were very heavily engaged in the missionary drives of the New World, as well as being heavily engaged in the spread of Christianity into such countries or regions as Japan and China. So what we have happening in the 15 and into the early 1600s is we see the Protestant Reformation continuing and that fragmentation continuing. We see at the same time a counter-reformation of the Catholic Church and a organized response to try and spread the ideas of Protestant Reformation. What wound up happening, of course, is we wind up seeing increased tension. We see out of control anti-Protestant movements like the Inquisition in Spain, as well as seeing increased Catholic Church activity in trying to formulate its beliefs and disseminate or to teach its followers exactly what the Catholic Church taught. And that's why you see on point number D, we see in 1566 the finished product, which is what we call a catechism. And what the catechism represented for the Catholic Church was a complete breakdown of all of the beliefs of the Catholic Church, of Roman Catholicism, as they were in 1566. It was a full definition, and it was something that had not ever been attempted and really consolidated into one work. And that's important to note. The Catechism didn't actually create new beliefs, but it consolidated and unified beliefs that had been basically practiced for over 1,000 years He consolidated them into one book, one source of information. Now, unfortunately, when we talk about the effects of the Reformation, they are extremely grounded in instability and warfare. This religious European fragmentation, which began in the Protestant Reformation, only continued throughout the 17 and 1800s. And the accompanying religious wars that went with the tension and the instability of Europe, those raged out of control primarily in the countries of the Holy Roman Empire and in Central Europe. And as time went on, it was an attempt of the European people to try and downplay religious differences, to try and prevent these wars and this tension and shifts of population and instability that would ultimately reach their conclusion in that event that we'll study later, which is called the Enlightenment. And so, just to recap, what we see in the Protestant Reformation is we see a fragmentation of the Christian church, resultant intermittent and serious or extremely bloodthirsty wars that took place primarily in Central Europe. And we see a reaction to that developing in the intellectual circles of Europe that are going to seek to downplay religious identity. In fact, not only to downplay it, but eventually privatize it and make it completely unimportant when it comes to European society. And we're going to see in the aftermath of that movement of the Enlightenment to downplay and eliminate religious tension, we're going to see the rise of different ideas to try and create a new identity for Europeans, one that is either based on political affiliation or internal culture and the idea of being part of something larger, which we'll call the modern state. So I thank you for listening to this lecture. I hope it's been informative. If you have any questions, please let me know. And once again, I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.